Hi, this is Michael Vecchio from the Deli magazine. Today we'll be going to Steve Maxwell's Vintage and Custom Drum Shop to speak with manager Jess Birch about drum construction and history.
I discovered this place because I was up at Rudy's Repair Shop, which is right upstairs. This is 7th Avenue, just at 48th Street. So if you know Rudy's Repair Shop is on the 4th floor, or one floor below, this is Steve Maxwell's. And I came in and it was like stepping into heaven or something. It's just like all these old kits, and these guys know everything about construction and all that stuff, and so they can be very, very helpful. I actually have a Lady kit from the 1950s that I was having a lot of trouble tuning the floor tom because the head wasn't seating properly. And I thought, you know, this thing needs to be re-edged or something. And I brought it into Jess, and he took a look at it and was like, because I originally thought it was from the 60s, and he looked at the badge and did some, you know, poking around with it and realized that it was from the 50s actually, and decided that based on that I needed a special antique head that has a slightly bigger hoop so it'll seat properly, and it totally solved my problems. You can come in here, they have a whole cymbal room that you can throw on cymbals on any kit or hi-hats or whatever. It's pretty amazing. I really appreciate this place. It's a really, really special store, so worth checking out. This other room is sort of more of a museum type room with a lot of classic, amazing drums from yesteryear. So we're here with Jess Birch, who's the manager of Steve Maxwell. He's going to be taking us through our 3 vignettes.
Talk about shell construction in vintage drums that are pretty typical for 60s stuff, and the 4 big names, of course, in vintage drums: Rogers, Slingerland, Gretsch, and Ludwig. So we're going to just kind of go down the line and talk about each one of those. I guess we'll start with the Gretsch drum here. We have this is a round badge Gretsch, and they were using the round badge in the 50s. 60s, and stopped using it in the very early 70s. The early 50s to the late 50s, they were using a 3-ply shell. In the around 1957-58, they switched to a 6-ply shell for construction. But one of the classic things, or one of the things that gives Gretsch drums their particular sound, is the bearing edge, and that's going to be one of the most important things from drum to drum that distinguishes the drum's characteristics. Having a certain kind of bearing edge on a Ludwig drum versus the Rogers and a Slingerland, and then the Gretsch. So what makes the Gretsch special compared to the other ones is that it's rounded to the outside. So I don't know if you can get a close-up on that, but you can see that the bearing edge, instead of having a bevel towards the center inside of the drum, it's beveled to the outside. It's rounded from the inner ply out, and what that does is gives the Gretsch drums a little shorter, a little, in some cases, a drier stick attack sound. The drums also have a very lightweight shell, which is also part of the reason the Gretsch drums get the sound that they have. And a lot of these things are all kind of like a 10% rule, in the sense that there are 10 different things on a Rogers drum and 10 different things on a Gretsch drum that all kind of combine to make each drum different. But bearing edge on a Gretsch rounded to the outside, you get a lot of contact with the outer edge of the drum head, and therefore create a little drier sound, kind of a classic jazz sound with the Gretsch drums. If you have a sharper bearing edge and a perfectly round shell, you're going to get a longer note. Something that has a more rounded edge is going to dry the drum up and not allow it to resonate. The other thing that sometimes happens when you have a more rounded bearing edge is that it tends to take out some of the high end around the edges. So you get sometimes a thuddier or deeper sound, which is the case with a lot of the Slingerland things. You can see that they have a very thick bearing edge here, and it's rounded over, as opposed to having any kind of definite angle either going in or to the outside. So you have a lot of contact with the drum head there, which will dry again, make it a little drier, take some of the high end out of the drum, and make it a little thuddier. But you notice that the Gretsch drums were the only drums in the 60s to not be using a reinforcement hoop. There's a certain characteristic that happens because of these lightweight shells with no glue ring on the inside to reinforce the shell, is also one of the things that gives Gretsch drums their sound. So this is a mid-60s style shell, cross-laminated 6-ply shell with maple and actually gumwood back and forth. On the other end of the spectrum, you have a Slingerland shell, which is still a 3-ply shell at this point. Usually, there's 2 different combinations of shells that you'll see with Slingerland, and you see these in the 50s as well. Outside ply, a thin outside ply of mahogany, interior ply that's very thick of poplar, and then an interior ply of maple. Because you have a lot of soft woods, the drums tend to play have a little lower fundamental and tend to not be as bright. And because the drums also have a very round bearing edge, it's a little more difficult to get the tuning range on the drums is not as broad as, let's say, a Rogers drum, because you have to be able to get all of the wrinkles around the edges of the drums out, and they behave in a different way because they have the glue rings as well. But the fact that you have glue ring, rounded edge, and a softer wood construction of the shell will all kind of contribute to different characteristics than the Gretsch drums. The other thing that the Gretsch drums have in the 60s is we have die-cast hoops. They were the only people to use die-cast hoops, which is generally a modern thing. Wasn't until, I would say, that the 80s that some of the other drum companies started using die-cast. Die-cast hoops are hoops that are cast out of, I don't know what the alloy of die-cast is, but it's a very stiff hoop and tends to hold the drum head in place and doesn't move with the way that steel or even softer brass hoops will. On the other hand, Slingerland was using brass hoops. You can see that this magnet won't stick to the hoop, which is kind of a nice thing because it makes the drums a little warmer, a little more musical in some ways. With Ludwig, Slingerland, and Gretsch, you're going to find that you have to tune the drums a little higher in order to get the wrinkles out of the drum. Which brings us to the Rogers thing. Rogers was one of the first, along with Camco, and I'll show you, I have a Camco snare here to show you also. Rogers was one of the first people to recognize that the bearing edge is one of the most important aspects of drum building. That they started doing a very sharp edge around the bevel to the inside, and also a little bit of a round on the outside to get some nice contact with the curve of the drum head. But having a sharp bearing edge allowed the drum head to float on the bearing edge a little more than, let's say, the Slingerland style edge. They also were some of the first people to recognize that that building a slightly smaller drum allowed you to float the head on the sharp bearing edge. Gretsch is notorious for not being able to even sometimes get a Remo coated ambassador on the drums. You have to force it on with hammers and screwdrivers and things like that, and that also contributes to the fact that you have to tune the drum a little higher in order to get the wrinkles out. Rogers drums are very good all-around drums because you have they function very well in modern situations because they have a slightly smaller shell, they have sharp bearing edges, but yet you have the vintage vibe of having old wood and old construction. And they're always they always stay in round too because of the glue rings. Because of the weight of the drum, they have heavy-duty hardware. The shells are a little heavier than, let's say, the Slingerlands or the Gretsch. They also tend to be a little thuddier, a little lower in the fundamental, and tend to be very, very good rock drums for that reason. But their tuning range is much broader than any of the other companies. But I believe that Rogers was using a standard steel hoop, which is a nice stiff hoop too. It's kind of a compromise between a brass and a die-cast.
Just to speak to the point about making really good, them being very good rock drums, I actually tried a 20-inch kicked drum, a Rogers kick drum in here once, that was such a huge sounding kick drum. And Jess had explained to me it's because of the fact that it has a really sharp bearing edge. You can really keep the drum head very loose on there, and it still makes perfect contact, and you can keep it really big and fuzzy sounding.